Hello everyone, welcome to the Share Your Green Design podcast. Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder that you can follow and subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can also find the full video version of each episode over on YouTube. We're also on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of what is an ever-growing platform. So head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com to keep up to date with the latest in sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. We've got projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work, jobs, everything you need. We'd love to have you as a visitor, but also as a contributor, so you're always welcome to send us your own projects, ideas, events, job openings, and much more. You'll find all the details on shareyourgreendesign.com. Once again, that's shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you again for your support, and with that, we hope you enjoyed today's episode. To kick us off, do you want to introduce yourself to people listening and watching, and tell us a bit about who you are and where you are in the world?
Sure. Thanks for this, and I really appreciate being on this podcast. Looking forward to the discussion. And my name is Cecilia Wandiga. I am Executive Director of the Center for Science and Technology Innovation here in Nairobi, Kenya. We've been started about in 1998 as a UNESCO Associated Center, and we'll get into that a little later. I'm half Kenyan, half Puerto Rican, so I've lived in the US, Puerto Rico mainland, US, multiple states, and now came back to Kenya to get this started. My background is political science, bachelor's, and then master's, public policy and management. I'm working on my PhD in business management, but most of the work we do is natural sciences, chemistry, biology. We're getting a little into physics, so I have to learn how to use social science skills to understand the relevance of scientific research. What do you do with uh, all these complicated chemical words that one of my research was on biosurfactants. It took me, I think, 3 months to learn how to pronounce that. And then figuring out how to use that. And when I finally understood it, makes biosurfactants make things more soluble in water or liquid states. I'm like, oh, you can use them for detergents, for medicine, and learning how to bridge that gap between the what's normally sort of, even though it's a lot of scientific research is openly published, uh, the scientific community doesn't necessarily talk about research and discovery in the way you and I would talk about having a coffee. So trying to bridge that gap.
I love how you started by saying my background is in, because usually when people say my background is in, they say one thing, like my background is in architecture, my background is in science. You said my background is in, and then you listed out about 7 different fields, which is fascinating, and it's one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk to you, because I just love I love that idea of and I'm curious to hear about why you engage with so many fields. Is it just this inbuilt desire to explore things which interest you, or do you have a broader view, or just a broader outlook on the world, which kind of forms connections between all of these different things, and that's why you pursue them? So what kind of drives you to explore all these different fields?
It's the latter, it's the exploration, and it wasn't until I started getting executive coaching that I realized that I was switching field. When they were trying to figure out how do you, because to me it's always been either I'm looking at data or I'm solving a problem in sort of the development arena, because within the US I worked in economic development, brownfield rehabilitation, city planning, um, uh, SME, sort of new business career coaching, minority business development. So to me, it was all development. Um, and coming here to Kenya, it was, oh, there's a way to do science as a development tool. But listening to an executive coach who said, all of those are different fields, and then you did a stint in real estate. I was like, oh yeah, I did that because when we were doing city planning, we were having trouble understanding how it is that if we design, let's say, a affordable housing plan, how do we get those units, people to buy them? You've got the um, uh, affordable housing ministry, so to speak, taking all this time and a lot of money spent to design the units, and then afterwards real estate agents come and say, oh, you did this wrong and you did that wrong, and it won't sell because of this and it was sell because of that. And but we didn't have the data up front, and at the time it was very difficult to get that collaboration with the real estate, sort of licensed real estate sector. I was like, okay, if I become an agent, then we can get the data and we can have those and it did, and that's when I realized it's the people to people connection that makes the difference. It wasn't that once I became an agent, everybody's talking to me and it was a flood of information. I'm the same person who I was trying to get information from, sort of quote unquote the outside, and it wasn't working. So I think I just keep on looking at, and then insurance was to understand risk and all of that kind of stuff. So I think I just keep on looking at, here's the problem we need to solve, and here's how we want to do it. And opportunities come up. And also, people when you in the US, I did a lot of consulting. So consulting has moments, feast or famine moments in terms of income, and people saying, "Oh, you're good at this, try this too." And I thought there was sort of a very linear thread until, like you're saying, somebody said, "Here's the resume of somebody who's been very focused." I was like, oh, "Okay, mine doesn't look like that at all."
Yeah, I definitely can see in architecture a debate. I don't even want to call it a debate because it's not even that adversarial, of people who think the architect should be this kind of very the future of the profession is to really zone in and specialize on a particular thing, and then other people have this view of the architect as somebody who should adopt more of your kind of position and background of trying to understand as much about the world as possible, all the different forces that make up the modern world. I think I can't remember who I was talking to or who I was listening to. I think it was an architect, Liam Young. He's a kind of like I think he calls himself a speculative architect, but he's big into media, and he talked about how an architect is one of these people who is able to walk into a bar and have a meaningful conversation with a social scientist, a philosopher, a chemist, an author, an artist, a physicist. It's like we know a little bit about everything, and a lot of people, myself included, see that as a powerful attribute when we deal with something like climate change, because climate change is one of these issues where it's so multifaceted, so many moving parts. It really strikes at the core of how we have set up a society and a built environment, and that can't be confined to one discipline. So to have something like you, who is able to engage and understand and almost kind of, I think Steve Jobs had this quote once where his one of his colleagues, I think it was Steve Wozniacki, said to him, you ought to specialize more. You ought to. It's like learning how to play an instrument. And Steve Jobs says, I don't play an instrument. I play the orchestra. I always love that quote because and again, that it's very similar to what you're talking about, which is that trying to step back, to take like a broad, multifaceted view of the world and use that to mobilize and to affect change and to collaborate. So I guess I guess where that's leading towards is how have you found that approach? And do you think that's an approach that more people should adopt widely, or do you think we need this balance of people like yourself who can talk to about 10 different people with 10 different specialities, and then within a team you have people who are highly specialized that can kind of like take it to the next level, and it's that power of kind of collaboration that kind of moves the ball forward.
I think we kind of need both. And I've interacted with both types of architects. And of course, given my background, it's fun to talk to those who are broad ranging. And I know architecture, the discussions tend to be more on the design side. My discussions with architects tend to be more on the functional side. And when you look at it from the functional perspective, then to me, the conversations get really interesting because you start looking at the functionality of materials, the functionality of the space and the usage of the space and all of that. And the reason I say you need both is if, you know, a broad based architect has a lot of skills in being able to, especially those who talk to everybody, just amazing gifts at not only visualizing a space, but eliciting all the, like, would you like the wall here or there? Why does that make a difference to you? But then the specialists, when I've met, for example, specialists in vernacular architecture, you're sitting there and it's like in the US we say, global repository is a library of Congress, but maybe it's like a human Google of everything you ever wanted to know about vernacular architecture in different countries and the materials used, and you're just sitting there like, how can all that fit in one head? You know? So I think, and then there's those who design for special circumstances, like those who are really gifted at high performance structures in things that you don't even know, like in tornado proof buildings. Not that there is a tornado proof building, but looking at that sort of high performance environment and those who have that specialization. So I think probably a team that has both types of architects, like a thinking of it as a design team. And to your point about climate change, the breadth, depth, and severity of of issues across different climates, different locations is so varied that I don't think we can work with the solo architect model anymore. That would be one distinction I make. I think it has to be this thing of getting into collaborative teams and knowledge sharing and knowledge collaboration, but staying focused on the functionality, if that's going to be the unifying thread. What is the desired functionality, and that brings in cost, and that brings in culture, and all of those issues, the materials.
And that point then about sharing and collaboration brings us to what you're doing now, or I guess your main preoccupation now, which is the CSTI over in Nairobi, the Center for Science and Technology Innovations. Do you want to kind of introduce that organization to people who don't know it, and just maybe give us an introduction to how you got involved in it, and what you guys do on kind of a broad level?
So, started in 1998 as a UNESCO Associated Center. At the time, it was started by my father and some university colleagues. He's an inorganic chemist specialized in atmospheric research and had been studying climate change since, I don't know, since ever. I was born in 69. I remember his first paper was in 1972 about how termites eating dead wood trees cause methane gas emissions. And so my mother is a biochemist. Those were the household, what do you do at work kind of discussions. So he's done a lot of you know. I thought everybody had a house like that too.
No.
He's done a lot of research. I know. A lot of research in climate change, and at the time, this was around early 80s when before it was officially labeled as climate change. They were researching global warming, and the question was, would African countries, since the emissions were lower, would the impacts of, at the time called global warming, now climate change, would it be as severe in impact in African countries as it was anticipated in highly industrialized manufacturing countries? And the answer came out yes, not because of the emissions, but because one, this issue of once the emissions go up in the air, it affects global weather patterns was number one. Number two, there's less infrastructure, so less roads, less bridges, less ways to evacuate people quickly if there's a flood, less ways to store water adequately during drought seasons, and all of those things. And there's also lower incomes. And at the time, insurance policies were not really at all used for by the everyday citizen. So it was sort of a confluence of events that was creating a bad situation. And this was on the university research side. Then the question became, what do you do about it? How do you transfer this knowledge to the general public without sort of what's unfortunately become the norm, which is scaring everybody to death, like you're all going to die. This is bad. And so the CSTI approach was more, we have a problem, we know there are different possible solutions. Let's work together and figure out what works on the ground. And I think that's a lot more empowering approach to looking at climate change, because I don't know about you, but if somebody tells me I'm going to die, I'm not listening to what they say after that. If you go to a doctor and they say, "Oh, you've got 6 months to live. Here's what you need to do," it's like, no, why? So start doing everything else. Oh, let me go on a binge drink, or maybe let's spend all the money and go on a trip.
You've read my bucket list clearly.
Yes. So, and also having grown up in what in the US is called Generation X, and having grown up with the gloom and doom that we were all going to die because of a nuclear warfare. And now being 52, that risk is still there. But it was like, okay, people somehow got to their senses and realized that's just stupid. Um, so I think there's human capacity to realize, yes, we have a huge problem. Yes, it's a global and we need to collaborate. But we also have all the brains and scientists and people, and you don't even need to be a scientist. Sometimes somebody thinking at home could have a brilliant idea and say, what about this? So what we're trying to do is share the knowledge in sessions like this. And we have a Otsomo. So Otsomo is a Lua word for sort of a place where people gather to learn. And it can be an outside space, it can be a building, and we're creating an online space. And we do webinars, and we yes, we have the sort of scientists speaking, or the engineers speaking, or the people who have the technical knowledge speaking, but we try and contextualize it into more palatable discussions so that people can now think, oh, okay, I can do this or that with it.
I think that one of the one of the things you touched on there, which is interesting about the CSTI, is this link between the scientific, you might say the hard science, but also the humane, the inclusivity, I guess you would call it, of your approach. So it's like you're trying to combine the social with the scientific. You're trying to bring in human and science, and it's a lot more inclusive. So I was reading, and I think it's really actually cool to. I might read this out to people. So this is from the CSTI's mission, and I think it's a really interesting kind of little snippet that gets to what you're trying to do. So you say that on the one hand, technological advancement is changing the frontiers of human existence for the better. On the other hand, a two-class society is at risk of developing. Those who have the capacity to leverage the latest scientific advances experience economic growth. Those who do not have the capability to absorb and adapt scientific breakthroughs are being marginalized into obsolescence. The whole premise behind humans as rational beings is predicated on the assumption that we can use our intellect to rise above crude survival-based tendencies by collaborating in ways that guide human and societal evolution towards balance and improvement. We must use our multidisciplinary talents to find inclusive models that bring human obsolescence, that prevent human obsolescence by acting on the belief that human life and ecological life are the highest valued assets on the planet. Therefore, we must use scientific innovation to improve life as a means of preserving our most valued assets. It's an awesome mission statement that hits on so many different urgencies, or so many. It's very loaded. And I think one of the important things you touch on is trying to avoid a two-tier society, because we see this in almost every field, and it's particularly a conversation that occurs in architecture a lot, especially around, and this isn't exactly the topic maybe of this conversation or even this website, but it's particularly around the topic of regeneration. There's this long-running debate about is regeneration, when does regeneration turn into marginalization? How do you improve communities without disrupting them? And there's still no consensus on how to do that. So this, having an organization and an outlook and a mission which is aware of this two-tier society is really important, because I think, and it's been shown, I've read so many times about how climate change is going to disproportionately impact the poor for different reasons, because number one, poorer communities don't have as much say infrastructural development. There's a correlation between parts of the world. Different parts of the world are impacted more, which it brings in kind of histories of exploitation. But yeah, can you speak a bit more to this idea of trying to avoid a two-tier society, and what you think the role is of science and design of trying to avoid creating this two-tier society?
Yeah, and to your point, I'll hit regeneration, but I'll start with green buildings. And any technology adoption curve is always more expensive in the beginning, and until you get massive economies of scale because everybody's using it. But and sometimes you also have that the new normal, even with large economies of scale, is still more expensive than the old. So it might plateau at a level that it's higher. And the argument being made is that everybody should embrace this because you look at the total life cycle cost and over the life of the building, and this is assuming, because I'm learning different cultures, if you're assuming that you have an 80 to 100-year lifespan for the building structure, then it you have the back end savings. What that misses is the front end cost. You need the resources to be able to sort of get in the game. And I look at it sort of like a stock market, right? If you're trying to buy shares and make money, obviously you make more money the more money you put into it. And if you can squeak in, like, there used to be a time when you couldn't open a stock account without $5,000. And compared to those who have millions of dollars, $5,000 is absolutely cheap. But if you're living on $1 a day, $5,000 is more than you'll see in the next 10 years. So you don't have that upfront money to get in. And so there's a steel door that's being created. It's a transparent steel door, but it's an unbreach. If we could figure out how to make unbreachable transparent doors like that in real life, then we would solve all the building security issues. Um, so when we're looking at upfront cost, we've now created a two-tier society. When we're looking at culture, learned through collaboration with the International Sustainable Collaborative Center in Germany, where we're working on circular plastics and green buildings. And one of the architects in the group is from China, and she explained this notion of, yes, they have the historic buildings that have been around for centuries, but in modern architecture, the culture is, even if it's a massive 12-story building, you tear it down in 5 years. And that blew our minds, So this, yes, and so the idea is, and we were like, why? She's just like, well, people move and things move, and you want to keep updated, and you want to keep, this idea of the use in the space needs to be updated. If one time it's let's say it might be a space where you have residential, and then it becomes more appropriate for IT and tech people to move in, then you need to reconfigure that space for their needs. And when you have over 1 billion people and things are changing a lot, now the need to change buildings, including every 5 years if need to, you start to understand where that's coming from. Yet, if you have the sort of sustainable gurus, they would say, oh my God, that's horrible, and it goes against the long lasting principle. But what if you're recapturing all that material and reusing it somehow? Then now you start getting into those regeneration issues that you're talking about. It's not necessarily how long the building is or lasts, and can you recapture that embodied carbon? Can you recapture all that energy and have even maybe better output because you're reusing? In African context, a regenerative has a particularly painful connotation because, like, for example, Nairobi, Green City in the Sun, because it was part of the Ebenezer Howard Green City Master Plan. Until you read the history and learn the Green City Master Plan was designed to make a beautiful green space to keep, those people out. And there was no place for people to live. And then we wonder why we have slums or informal settlements. Well, it was because everything is a place where you have massive jobs and massive employment, all the industry, all the people with money, and hiring those people to do the work, but never creating a space for those people to live side by side. And what we start seeing is that even in societies that bias, that socioeconomic bias, carries across in everything that's done, because now there's no colonialism, but you look at the ways neighborhoods are being developed, and it's keep those people out. Even if everybody's the same, those people. So, in terms of social, ethnic ethnicity or background, now you have a class divide, or you have an ideological divide, and all that kind of stuff on religious grounds. So I think we're very good at segregating ourselves because we feel that if we don't, we lose our sense of identity. And if we lose our, psychologically, of course, you lose your sense of unique identity. You crumble, as it's very hard to function as a human being. But if we start thinking about our sense of identity from based on an idea that you can't change who somebody is. Like, there's other people in my family. There's, my sister. We have the same parents, but we came out to be very unique human beings. Identical twins. They have different habits, different behaviors, different. They have unique fingerprints, right? So there's if we predicate ourselves on that, like, take nobody will take that away from you. Then how do you come into the space? How do you uh, um, function and hold on to what you enjoy? Like, for example, I'm not particularly a fan of Art Deco in terms of architectural style. But if I went into an Art Deco building, I don't have to feel like I'm going to die and I won't be able to live because I'm in an Art Deco space. It would just be maybe asking somebody, can we redecorate this so it's a little more classic? If we're going to have to say period, I'd probably be a little more Baroque. Can you blend the two somehow? Things like that. So, and the same can happen in terms of cultural design. We have over 75 different ethnic groups in Kenya. How do you create a space that's ultra modern but make somebody feel like they're still in their cultural heritage space? And can we find out if that the materials used are better for regeneration? How do we, everybody talks about mud. Okay, mud. Mud can become clay, mud can become ceramics, mud can become geopolymer. So when you start getting into the materials research, it's no longer mud, you know. And how do we do that? I think it's a very interesting space to explore. That's what we're trying to bring into the dialogue.
You said a million interesting things there, but one, you were talking earlier about the difference in outlook between people you were talking to. I think it was in China about a much shorter lifespan of buildings, and going further about about how do we how do we solve global issues without impacting too much or altering too much people's identities or hijacking people's identities. And it reminds me of what I think is becoming kind of a recurring theme on this podcast. It's been mentioned, I think, by two different guests have talked about this, how when you stand all the way back, we have a global system which is almost entirely predicated on continuous economic growth. We haven't, as a civilization, or most countries in the world, we actually haven't figured out how to function in a society or an era which doesn't have continued growth. If a country goes into, one of the worst things that can happen in our own minds to a country is for it to go into an economic decline, and that when you zoom out far enough, that is a that is a fundamental problem when trying to address climate change, because you're trying to almost kind of stem this tide of more products, more mining, more excavation, more manufacturing, and it brings up, and this actually then links in a weird way to what you were talking about with the Art Deco building, about you personally don't like Art Deco, but you know that you're not insisting that all Art Deco buildings be torn down. There's other ways to approach your dislike of Art Deco buildings, and it's all part of the same question, which is, what are the parameters in when it comes to climate change? What can we change and what can we not change? So most people would say, even if they don't like it, would say that it's going to be very, very difficult for us to do away with this model of continued growth, especially in the short time frames we're talking about, in order to address climate change, where we're talking about years and decades rather than centuries. And it goes to the question of the role of scientific innovation, because some people would be nervous that we are using scientific innovation as a kind of get out of jail free card or as a crutch and saying, well, we don't need to change anything because we're just going to keep innovating more. We're going to, we don't need to build with less concrete, even though it produces all these emissions, because we're just going to invent something that sucks those carbon emissions out of the sky again. There seems to be this balancing act between innovation and cultural slash societal slash human behavioral change, and it's a really difficult balance to get because, and again, this is this is layer upon layer, but that then goes back to what we were talking about earlier about a two-tier society, because when you start to, if we then decide that okay, actually, in order to address climate change, we need to start changing people's behavioral patterns, we need to start we need to start altering aspects of their life, what they do and don't have access to. That is one road to a two-tier society. So one example, if you say that we're going to put a tax on petrol, on oil for or diesel for cars, that because on the face of it that's a way to stop people from driving less, but of course model after model has shown that that's going to disproportionately impact poorer or lower income people who say have no choice, and particularly in the American context this is true, have no choice but to drive to work. If you're if you're rich, you might live in an area which is closer to where you work. You might work from home. It's again, it's not something. It's not something that's going to be solved on one podcast. But I guess if we could distill it into one question, it would be: where do you think how important or how much reliance should we have on scientific innovation, like the kind of things we see at the CSTI or that you've seen elsewhere? How much can we rely on that to start to address climate change, or does it need to work in tandem and maybe complement shifts in behavior or facilitate shifts in behavior that don't necessarily cause this two-tier society that we're worried about?
Yeah, I think so. Let me address that on multiple levels. Let me start by shifting the philosophy on growth a little. If we look at biology, um, we start understanding why we think, we don't design trees so that they stop growing. When we're babies, we're designed to grow. So there's this biological imperative towards growth. Now, when you look at physics, you also understand that there are decay cycles in biology and everything, and they call those entropy. And I also started a consulting firm called Global Ectropy, and ectropy is a theoretical position that could you have continuous growth, sustainable continuous growth, and unlimited. So that would be sort of the basis of thinking that you could have uh, could you live forever is one example of ectropy. Could you have a perpetual motion machine is those are examples of ectropy. When you are looking at it from that perspective, then it becomes exciting. Some people say scary because they're saying, oh, it violates the natural order of life, death, and cycles. But there's also, if you look at it from the Buddhist perspective, there's that regeneration, like this, it's one generation after another after another. So when you look at that of generational sequences, just like we say one, we didn't talk in this language before, but there was dot zero, and now there's 1.0, 2.0, industry 4.0. Now we're coming with all these IT things. I think innovation has to be approached from the perspective of contextual use. When we used to walk, the horse and buggy was an innovation. And we abandoned the horse and buggy as an innovation because there was too much poop on the ground all the time. And when we had to move as we started developing more trade and you have to move large bales, the horses get exhausted. And all of a sudden we said this new idea called a steam engine, and we can put it on a train. And so we did that. And then the problem was we couldn't distribute goods radially. So then came the idea of the car, and it was too expensive for everybody. And then there were some scientists who knew that the car would cause global emissions and global warming, but we still needed to get to places. And there was no way of figuring out at the time how do we, the idea of solar vehicles came probably later, but not at the time when we knew that there would be a problem with emissions. So it was, to your point, let's do this and solve the problem later. We have cars. Now we're coming up with solar vehicles, and we know we have a problem with the batteries and the unsustainable mining of lithium and the ingredients, but let's solve that later. And also with the disposal. And I think the same is going to happen with architecture. What do we need our buildings to do? In some places that, like given in Puerto Rico, we're in the middle of hurricane zones. You no longer need a house; you need a fortress nowadays. And the other thing is water purification. You can live on an island. Most of the Caribbean islands are facing this. It's hard to think that on a tropical island you'll experience drought. But what that means is you're experiencing freshwater scarcity. If there's not enough rain, you're still in a lush green environment, but you have freshwater scarcity. In African countries, there's more depiction of dry areas, arid and semi-arid areas. We've run out of all this, chop down trees for firewood. So African countries are in the tropical latitude, but they're looking right now more like desert. And chopping down all that firewood has nothing to do with manufacturing emissions, even though, yes, the firewood causes that, but it's not an industrialized type machine driven emissions. It's a human need for fuel driven emission problem. And also the lack of replanting then depletes the regeneration. So if we look at it that way, then what we start to think about is, why aren't we, like something like trees, why aren't we doing the obvious? Why aren't we replanting as fast as we cut down? And the obvious answer becomes because we're using that space. We're using that space for agriculture. We're using that space for buildings. We're using that space for everything but the trees. Um, People say, oh, too many people, too much population, but there are other parts of the world that are saying we don't have enough youth. We don't, we're really scared our whole economy is going to collapse because we don't have enough of the future generation. So that's another extreme. Um, and I think if we get away from these prescriptive doomsday scenarios, and I think you were mentioning this idea of strategic planning, and not strategic planning in a military sense, but strategic planning in a utility sense. How do we come at different needs and reconcile different needs, and sort of do a balancing act, so that we start saying, okay, this works here, it doesn't work there. We need this here, we don't need that there. This can grow here, but it won't grow there. And if we're going to plan for obsolescence, which is a whole different issue, let's plan for obsolescence and reuse, not just obsolescence and disposal into, because this notion before, the notion of landfills, that's another innovation. Before it was piling up in your backyard, and everybody decided, no, let's have a place where it piles up. But we never thought, okay, if it keeps on piling up over the years, what are we going to do with that stuff? Now we've reached the point where all over the world we've got these piles, and it's kind of like in your house when you're saying, "Oh, this is my I'll do it later, sort it later pile," and then you come in and it's like the sorted later pile has taken over the whole room. And so, unfortunately, all you do is call a garbage collector and tell them to take it somewhere, and that becomes the sorted later pile for everybody else. So we need to start thinking about these things in more strategically instead of it's somebody else's problem and let's solve it later. I really like that. Let's not leave it for later. Let's start thinking about the now. And let's think about the now, not just, my belief or what I get excited about. Like I can get very excited about AI. I could get excited about different technologies, but if to your point, like I love working from home, but if you don't have electricity and you can't, or if you're in an area where 90% of your income is going for food and shelter, where are you going to get the money to pay for that internet and that laptop and that computer to be able? It's not that you don't want to work at home. You absolutely want to work at home, but you don't, and you also probably living in a shared space. So where do you even get the space to sit and have a conversation like we're having uninterrupted? You can't, because it's 5, 7 people living in the same space. So being cognizant of, yes, there are innovations, and yes, there are things coming out that are really enabling, but how do we, which is the real side of disruptive technology. Everybody likes to talk about um, the theory of disruptive technology. Oh, you bring, like somebody said, why do you want to be disruptive? But the real issue about disruptive technology, the theory says, is how do you bring something that was high end in terms of cost and to a new market in a different way, or to break the cost barrier so that more people can access that in a new way. So increasing affordability. That was the real premise of Claire Anderson's theory. And I think there's too much emphasis placed on being, disrupting the status quo without thinking of the why. Why are you reaching a new market? Why are you, and how are you increasing the affordability? Are you truly increasing that affordability? And if we can think of that in terms of housing construction disruption, it's not about, oh, let's bring a new fad in design. It's, if we're going to bring a new fad in design, who is the new target market? Who is going to afford this more and better? And look at it, bring it down to that level of discussion. Now we're having a strategic discussion.
This reminds me a lot of the topic and the what would you call it? The kind of project that where we were kind of introduced to each other originally, which was about master planning slash strategic planning in Kenya. And I think in Nairobi. Is it was it in Nairobi, or
Yes.
was it in was it a different part of Kenya?
Yes, in Nairobi.
It's an interesting project to briefly reflect on because it's actually a good way of grounding a lot of what we've just talked about. And you kind of mentioned it earlier about introducing this idea of strategic planning, not in the military sense. That's actually quite funny. I didn't even twig that comparison, but um, and I was reading a little bit about this last week about, I think it was actually a paper published by two researchers in South Africa, and they were talking about the history of master planning on the African continent and its historic connection to colonialism, and how it either served a European economic interests, or if it did serve any interests on the African continent, it was only really serving an elite class in the African continent. And it's that the paper was kind of warning that we still haven't moved. We might have moved past the overt colonialism in a continent like Africa, where you're seeing you've seen a rapid reduction in decades of European countries or the US occupying or owning these countries. But master planning is still it's still a very loaded and sometimes a very dangerous way of shaping a society, even if it's not through a colonial lens, because you're often inserting this internationalist outlook from one part of the world on another, usually through the creation of entirely new cities and districts, usually very rapidly. And in the traditional model, there still isn't much engagement with local populations, understandings of local cultures, and it's where this idea of strategic planning comes in. And this is the focus of the paper that the two of us were going back and forth on, of this new model in the Kenyan context of questioning, are these kind of formal master planning principles that we've applied, that we've taken from Europe and the US and we've historically applied elsewhere, is that still the best way of structuring a society? Maybe not. Maybe there's another way, which is maybe more informal, which is more organic, maybe. And I'll let you unpack that a bit more, but just as also to say, it's a really interesting point to feed in what we talked about earlier about the role of innovation, because it's an example of how the human and the scientific don't always have to be in tension, because one of the ways you could shape a more kind of strategic, localized planning approach is through using technology to gain local people's insights or feedback. I think Carlo Ratti from MIT talks about this a lot. He talked about it in the Brazilian context, about how you can take some of the principles of formal top-down master planning approach, but you can use innovation and you can use science to create feedback loops with local populations, which can guide and inform how a city grows. So it doesn't, the scientific and the human doesn't always have to be in tension. They can actually work together. But do you want to maybe give a bit of an insight into your own thoughts on what you've been looking at with strategic planning in Kenya and the project, or the kind of approach that we were going back and forth on?
Yeah, and you're right. Master planning is a loaded approach. So the implication is that, which, a lot of us have done, is you go to a school and you pay and you get trained, and you now have certified skills, and you've been trained in the right way to do things. And now you're sort of a guru, a master, and you benevolently help others to realize the right way to do things. And that's how you're sharing your skill. And you're not being oppressionist when you're trying to say, oh, and, in this area in Nairobi, you should reconfigure from this absolute chaotic land use plan to um, uh, proper use and distribution of rectangular square grids. And if everybody could just conform to the use of rectangular square grids, then perfect. The problem is that specialization comes from intentional or not intentional, like you were saying in the colonial era, it was intentional use of squares and grids and circles and designed to keep people out. Now, what happens is it's intentional use of spaces to generate economic profit. And we have all these architectural models that are profitable or not, depending on if you use squares, grids, circles, and all these other stuff. But when you change the lens, and by change the lens, I'm saying that these are models in terms of economic profit that have worked very well in a lot of Western countries. But we had Professor Ron English, who's a computational mathematician now at University of Michigan. But when he was at he some 20 years ago, he was looking at the layout from the satellite images of different African villages, and he went, "Wait a minute, those are fractal layouts." And he's like, could it be that all this time uh, Africans have been using fractal layouts in land use planning, and fractal being sort of what's considered Mandelbrot and all that theory, and it's very advanced scientific research in physics and mathematics and blah 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 blah, and repeating self-repeating shapes, so self-similar, like across, you can repeat it over and over, and you can grow in size and shrink, but it doesn't turn into a circle. So you have these shapes that, and what he started to research was then, faced with the argument, are these indigenous traditions, are they uniquely African? Because the assumption was, oh, they learned that from the colonials. The answer is no, no, they did not. When you look as far back in African history, they didn't learn it from the Asians. We didn't learn it from the colonials. We didn't learn it. This is how it was. If anything, there's evidence that it's been the reverse. What some of these Western discoveries, consciously or unconsciously, emerge from having observed things in the African space. So now you look at the same village layout, and when you put a fractal, you elicit a fractal pattern, everything fits, everything works perfectly. And fractals also tend to be very good for emergent design, emergent land use, because they can easily be reconfigured. You can take your rectangular square plot and divide it in using triangles, and that's a subdivision. And you can make it very and keep on reducing and reducing and reducing that size, and that's what you see in the informal settlements. They don't sit down and say, the zoning code says this. It's like, somebody needs a room and a space to live, and I'll create that room and space to live. And it's a characteristic of informal settlements that you also see across the world, whether it's Asia, India, Latin America, is this rapid adaptability. You need space, we'll make it for you. You need to do this, and if we start looking at that high level, on the master planning side, we're thinking, how do we make spaces adaptable and reconfigurable and emergent? And on the quote unquote, let's ignore it because that's the informal planning sector where every nothing ever works. It's there. Everything you're looking for is there. So if we start doing the same thing that we did in the master planning space, which is, how do you formalize that as knowledge? How do you formalize that as planning design metrics? Because if you go into these informal spaces and you ask them to cost it out for you, they know it off the top of their head. This won't work here. Yes, they don't need a PhD to tell you that. They just, oh yeah, yeah, do it this way. This is better. This is better. So taking that and recognizing that as a knowledge that needs to be, one, elucidated and translated into sort of the more formal scientific journal paper that we all use to say that we're masters, and co-creating those kind of publications, but then also the utility of that. So it's not to learn that and then say, oh, it doesn't work. Well, maybe the two spaces can't coexist. So what if, instead of trying to take the formal master planning space and alter the informal planning space, can we take the principles of informal planning space design and alter the formal master plan space, and keep the beauty and aesthetics and everything else, that which is also a value statement and very loaded term, that we like in the master planning approach. And that kind of reverse knowledge it's more to your point in the beginning about the quest for exploration, if we focus on the exploration and if we focus on the function, then it's less about the socioeconomic divide and more about how can we learn from each other? How can we help each other out?
This was the point I was going to come on to and maybe and ask you about next, which is really linked to that, which is you have a lot of experience now in Kenya and Nairobi. You've mentioned about your experience in Puerto Rico and in the US context. Very different parts of the world, different different geographies, climates, cultures. There's this long running question and if we focus particularly on sustainability and even sustainability in the built environment, what opportunities are there for collaboration, and where do we need to recognize differences? And you kind of answered it already. You talked about how you can take these seemingly divergent approaches, a top down master planning approach or a bottom up strategic planning approach, and you can bring the necessary people together, whether that's local policymakers, local citizens, community representatives, architects, engineers, social scientists, etc. You can bring them together and pragmatically come to a conclusion about what's the best approach for a particular place. And sometimes it might be this very top-down approach, a master planned approach. Sometimes it might be a very strategic bottom-up approach. And a lot of times it's probably going to be some kind of blend of the two. I'm curious, and this is a very subjective question, how have there been any particular elements or approaches to sustainability or outlooks on sustainability that you've seen from the different parts of the world that you've experienced that have really kind of stood out for you or have stayed with you? So for example, you've talked a lot about kind of fractal planning in the African context, which seems to it's kind of a long running thread through your work and has clearly had an impact. Can you think of any other kind of examples of something which has really stood out, even whether it's on like a micro level or on a citywide level, something kind of intriguing that maybe other people can keep in mind?
So I think this notion inherent in sustainability is this notion of participatory planning. We have participatory science. Now we're calling it citizen science, and there's different degradations because the reason for the distinction is originally participatory was you had the scientists and they would talk to the community and engage and allow the community to give feedback, but not necessarily do the scientific research. Now we're graduating into citizen science where the citizens, even though they're not trained scientists, are participating in the research and qualify for co-publication. So looking at it that way, is it possible to have going from participatory design in architecture to citizen design in architecture, where you have a linkage between the architects, the specialists, the engineers, and everybody, and you have the citizens looking at the design space and giving recommendations and becoming par on par. It recognizes equals to the professionals in the designing a space. And I haven't seen that discussion. I've heard of collaborative architecture where it's more feedback and charrettes and maybe parquet diagrams and looking at that in terms of taking in the input, but not necessarily of simultaneously co-designing a space at the same time. And I think that would be something that would be very interesting if it could emerge in the architectural space and also the materials research space, because the ability to develop new materials that could have climate related functionality in terms of passive cooling, passive heating, all of this. We do need innovation in that space. It might still be concrete or it might still be wood. I don't know. But turning that material into sort of like CO2 absorbing cement, or mycelium wood instead of tree-based wood. There's so many different types of things that we need to think about in terms of, can this be done? Where can it be done? And how can it be done? And that's, I think, where all over the world, you have indigenous groups with a lot of knowledge that could inform material science. Also, they have traditional ways of building that could inform the formal practice of building. Uh, you know, thinking of functional space differently. Like, we discussed a little bit about China and taking down buildings in 5 years. That's a functional decision. Living in trees, that's a functional decision instead of living on the ground. Um, and instead of saying that's primitive, think of it, that's kind of a brilliant way to keep the trees and have houses, right? But we tend to use materials that are too heavy for the tree. So how do we do that? How do we maybe reconfigure our structures on, I don't know, pillars or something? There's some people who live on boats. I would get seasick, but there are some people who live on boats. Do we want? And so the biggest problem when you live on boat is, where does the trash go? How do we collect the trash and not put it in the water? Um, all these are functional things that, if we can, and another thing that we've been talking about is this: it's not necessarily a globally accessible tool right now, but this notion of digital twins, which is opening. You need the 5G, and you need the VR, and you need all that kind of stuff, space. But this notion of taking the real space and creating taking all the measurements and characteristics and energy flows, and reconfiguring that space into a digitally simulated alternate environment that has, and seeing if these ideas work. And that would be a low cost entry point, rather than actually trying to say, oh, let's design it on paper and knock the buildings down and see what happens. And let's do it in a digital twin environment, and let's see what happens. Let's see what it looks like. Let's see how people react. Let's see if the dynamics model out the same way we think they would be. And I think that's there's scary uses of artificial intelligence, AI, but this would be a very positive use of AI, I would think, transformative.
I definitely agree with that. I think that digital twins is topic which I think on this podcast we're going to return to a lot, but I can really see the potential, which is largely untapped, maybe just because we're only now developing the technology to do it. But this ability to experiment in digital space without and avoiding not just the material waste of, say, failed ideas in physical space, but also avoiding the human toll that it takes about upending people's lives, being able to as accurately as possible investigate and interrogate the outcomes of different moves. Yeah, I think it's going to be a fundamental part of architecture and planning. And it's another, and the overarching point you made about citizen participation and kind of democratized design. I think digital twins will be another method of doing that, where not only through direct feedback from people, like verbally telling architects and planners what they think and what their values are, but being able to understand that, but without interfering with privacy concerns. Being able to actually understand the data behind their behavior and behind their decision making, which is incredibly powerful thing. To wrap this all up, then, would you call yourself positive and optimistic about the future, or are you pessimistic about our ability to tackle climate change in the built environment?
I think I'm obtusely positive. And the reason I say obtusely positive is, uh, A mentor once told me, whether you think you can or whether you think you cannot, you're right. And that was to help me get out of a rut. And when you think you cannot, your mind, your subconscious, everything, all your brain energy is focused on why it won't work. When you say, I can, even if I don't know how or why or when, your mind is always, like the famous story, you never notice red cars until you decide to buy one. Then you see every red car on the street and you're looking at it, right? So the same thing, once we decide that we can because we must, then our minds start looking in that direction. So that's why I'm obtusely positive, because we must. So we'll figure it out.
So finally, people who are looking to get in touch with you or learn more about you, how can they do that? LinkedIn or
Yeah, definitely on
website?
LinkedIn. Yeah, LinkedIn, and on our website we have info at csti.or.ke. And LinkedIn also, I check it daily, so I could start up a conversation there as well. Those are the places I tend to check more often for information. So and that would be the easiest way, I think. Yeah.
That's all from us for now, so thank you for tuning into this episode of the Share Your Green Design podcast. Just a reminder before you go, you can subscribe to us over on Spotify, Apple, or anywhere you get your podcasts, or if you prefer watching the conversation, you can find us on YouTube. You can follow us over on Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and WeChat at Share Your Green Design. That's all one word, Share Your Green Design. And remember, the podcast is only one small part of a much larger platform dedicated to sustainable architecture, engineering, and construction. To keep up to date with the latest projects, news, research, events, competitions, student work and job adverts, head on over to shareyourgreendesign.com. Thank you everyone for your support, and we'll see you next time.